Chapter 1. And if it's a boy, Philetus said cheerfully, we'll call him Prospero. I laughed. Poor child. But why Prospero? Oh, of course, because of Prospero in The Tempest. Corfu was Shakespeare's magic island in The Tempest, wasn't it? Yes. We've already got one character from the play here, Miranda. And her brother's called Spiro, which sounds a bit like Prospero, doesn't it? Miranda and Spiro are twins. My sister smiled at me, and reached for the coffee pot. More coffee, Lucy? She asked. We were having breakfast outside in the sun, on the terrace of my sister's house on the beautiful island of Corfu, which lies off the west coast of Greece. Below the terrace, wooded cliffs fell steeply to a small, sheltered bay, where the sea lay calm and still. From where we sat, we could not see the bay, as it was hidden by the trees. But we had a wonderful view out across the sea, and to the north we could just see the snow-topped mountains of Albania in the distance. My sister Philida is 3 years older than I am, and when she was 20, she married a Roman banker, Leonardo Forlì. The Forlì family had owned land on Corfu for many years, and Leo's great-grandfather had built an enormous house, the Castello de Fiori, in the woods above the bay. Later, Leo's father had built 2 smaller, more modern houses on the cliffs on the north and south sides of the bay. The house on the northern side was called the Villa Forlì, and it was used by Philida and Leo. The house on the southern side was called the Villa Rava, and it stood above the big boathouse, which Leo's great-grandfather had built. This villa was rented by an Englishman, Godfrey Manning, who had been there since the previous autumn. He was writing a book, Philida had told me, and was taking a lot of photographs for it. The 3 houses were connected with the main road by the private road up to the Castello, and connected to each other by various paths through the woods and down to the bay. That spring Philida was expecting her 3rd child, and the heat in Rome was too much for her. Therefore, Leo had persuaded her to go to Corfu, and to leave the other 2 children, who were at school, in the care of their grandmother in Rome. Leo, of course, was working, but he was going to visit Corfu at weekends whenever he could. Philida had asked me to go and stay with her, and her invitation had come just at the right time. I'm an actress, and the play I was in, my first in London, had closed after only 2 months. I was feeling very miserable. It had been a bad winter, and I was tired, depressed, and seriously wondering, at the age of 25, if I should look for a different job. So it was wonderful to find myself on this magic island, with the sun shining brightly. It was far away from the cold of an English April. I sat back in my chair, drank my coffee, and enjoyed the peace and beauty as I looked out towards the distant snows of Albania. "Well, Corfu is certainly a magic island for me," I said dreamily. "Who are these Shakespearean twins of yours, anyway?" "Oh, they're Maria's children. Maria is the woman who works for us here. Miranda helps her mother here, and Spiro works for Godfrey Manning at the Villa Rava. Maria and the twins live in the village." But I could see that Philida had something else that she wanted to tell me. "Someone very famous is renting the castello," she informed me. "What? That huge old house?" I said. "Who wants to rent that?" "Julian Gale. Julian Gale." I sat up suddenly and stared at Philida in surprise. "Do you mean Julian Gale, the actor?" "Yes," my sister replied, pleased by my excitement. Julian Gale had been one of Britain's finest actors for many years, and then 2 years ago, he had suddenly left the theater and disappeared. "So he came here," I said. "I knew he was ill after that terrible accident, but then he just disappeared." "Yes, well," Philida said, "he doesn't go out and nobody is allowed to go to the house, so I don't imagine that you'll even meet him." "The Tempest was the last play he did," I said. "He was wonderful in it." I remember crying my eyes out over the famous This Rough Magic speech. "Is that why he came to Corfu?" Philida laughed. "I don't think so," she replied. "He was here during the war, and then he stayed on afterwards. Before his wife and daughter were killed in the accident, they all used to come here for holidays. He probably just remembered the castello when he needed to disappear." Just then, a young girl of about 17 came in. She was wearing a red dress, which went well with her dark skin and hair. She had come to take away the breakfast things. She looked at me curiously, and then she smiled. "This is Miranda," explained Philida. "If you want to go swimming this morning, I'll ask her to show you the way." "I'd love to," I replied. Philida turned to Miranda. "Will you show my sister the way to the beach when you've finished that, Miranda?" "Of course," Miranda said, smiling. The way to the beach was through the trees, and in a while, we came to a fork in the path. The downhill path led to the beach and the uphill one, Miranda told me, was the private path to the castello. "Where's the other villa?" "Mr. Manning's?" I asked. "On the other side of the bay, at the top of the cliff," she replied. "You can't see it from the beach because of the trees, but there's a path from the boathouse up the cliff. My brother Spiro works there." "What about your father?" I asked her. "Where does he work?" "My father left us many years ago. He went over there." She pointed towards Albania. "He was a communist." Nobody can travel to Albania, so we don't know if my father is alive or dead." Her eyes grew bright. "But we have Spiro," she said. "Well, thanks very much, Miranda," I said. "Please tell my sister that I'll be back for lunch." I turned down the steep path under the trees. At the first bend, I looked back. Miranda had gone, but I thought I saw something red on the forbidden path to the castello. Chapter 2. The bay was very quiet and there was no one else there. I changed into my swimsuit very quickly, under the trees. Then I crossed the hot, white sand. The blue-green water felt cool and silky and I swam gently along near the shore. Then I turned and floated lazily on my back, with my eyes closed against the bright sun. Suddenly, I felt something cold swim past my leg. Afraid, I looked around wildly to see what it was. I saw something coming back towards me. "Sharks!" I screamed silently. I didn't wait, but swam madly towards the rocks. When I reached them, I managed to pull myself up and climb out of the water. Then I turned to look again. It wasn't a shark. It was a dolphin. He lay quietly in the water and looked at me with his bright eyes. I watched him in delight. I knew what he wanted. The dolphin was inviting me, Lucy Waring, to go into the water and play with him. But as I was about to go back into the water to join him, I heard a strange sound. Something flew past my ear and hit the water in front of the dolphin. It happened again. And suddenly I realized what was happening. These were bullets, someone was shooting at the dolphin. The shots were coming from the woods above the bay, and I shouted as loudly as I could, "Stop that shooting! Stop it at once!" I swam forward quickly into the sunlight. I hoped that my rough movement would frighten the dolphin and that he would swim away from the danger. It did frighten him. He went under the water and disappeared. I turned to look up at the cliffs. I could see the top of the Castello de Fiori and its terrace. There was a man standing there, watching me. It was not Sir Julian because this man was too young and too dark. Perhaps it was his gardener. I was very angry. Quickly, I picked up my things and ran towards the steps, which led up to the terrace. The man waved to me and pointed southwards. "That way, please," he shouted in English. I didn't listen. I was going to tell him what I thought and I went up those steps fast. Suddenly I came face to face with the man. He had come down to meet me and was waiting for me. "This is private ground," he said coldly. "Perhaps you'll be good enough to leave the way you came." This only takes you to the terrace, and then through the house. I wasted no words. Why were you shooting at that dolphin? I asked. He looked surprised and puzzled. What are you talking about? He said. Don't pretend that you don't know. I saw you. I certainly saw a dolphin, he admitted, but I didn't see you until you shouted and jumped out from the trees. But you must have made a mistake. I heard nothing. Anyway, why would anybody want to shoot a dolphin? I'm asking you, I said. For a moment, I thought I had said too much. He frowned angrily, and as we stared at each other in silence, I noticed him properly for the first time. I saw a strongly built man of about 30, carelessly dressed, with dark hair and eyes. His appearance suggested an aggressive character, I thought, but there was also something sensitive about the mouth. However, at the moment the aggressiveness was much more noticeable. Well, he said sharply, I'm afraid you'll have to take my word for it. I do not shoot at the dolphin. And now, please excuse me. Would you please go back the way I came? All right. I'm sorry. Perhaps I was wrong about you, but I wasn't wrong about the shooting. If it wasn't you, do you know who it was? No. Not the gardener. No. Or Mr. Manning? Number. He's been taking photographs of the dolphin for weeks. He and the Grec boy, Spiro, tamed it. Oh. It wouldn't be him, then. Well, we'll just have to try and stop the person who's doing it, won't we? He said quickly. We? Yes. I'm Lucy Waring, Philida Forley's sister. Are you staying with Sir Julian? I'm his son. So you're Miss Waring. I hadn't realized you were here already. He hesitated. Is Leo Forley at home now? No, I said shortly, and turned to go. I'm sorry if I was a little rude, he apologized. We've had so many people here lately, and my father. He's been ill and he came here to get better. He needs peace. And I'm a musician. I need quiet to work. Well, I said, I'm sorry if I've stopped you from working. I'll go now and let you get on with it. Goodbye, Mr. Gale. He left, and soon I heard voices, and then music. I could be sure that I was already forgotten. Chapter 3. When I had taken a shower and dressed, I felt calmer and I was ready to tell Philida all about the dolphin and the disagreeable Mr. Gale. I went out onto the terrace, but she wasn't there. Miranda and her mother weren't there either. Then I heard the door from the kitchen open, and my sister came into the living room. Lucy? Is that you? She called. I'm out here, I replied, and I went towards the French windows, which led into the living room. One look at her face made me forget everything. Foul. What's the matter? You look terrible. Something awful has happened. Poor Maria's boy has been drowned, Spiro, the boy I told you about at breakfast. Foul. How terrible. But, how? When? Last night. He was out with Godfrey on the boat, you know, Godfrey Manning, and there was an accident. Spiro fell over the side of the boat, and was drowned. Godfrey's come over to tell us, and I've just told Maria and Miranda. I've sent them home now. She put a hand to her head. Lucy, it was so awful. Godfrey's still here. Come and meet him. We went through into the living room. At the far end, there was a man with his back to us. He was pouring himself a drink. When we came in, he turned. He was tall and toughly built, with brown hair made lighter by the sun, a narrow, clever face and tired gray eyes. He was probably about 35 years of age. Violeta introduced us, but he was really more interested in her than in me. You've told them? He said. Was it very bad? Worse than bad. Of course. Look, Fa, do you think I should go and talk to them now? Number. Wait. Just at the moment I don't think Maria can believe that Spiro's dead. Violeta looked up at him. Godfrey, she said, I suppose there's no doubt, is there? He really is dead? Well, that's it, you see. That's why I didn't come here immediately. I've been phoning. I was trying to discover if his body had been found. But I'm sure he can't be alive. I saw him go over the side. What happened? I asked. Do you know, said Godfrey, I'm still not really sure. I'm beginning to wonder just how much I really do remember. I'm sorry. Perhaps you don't want to talk about it. I shouldn't have asked, I said. It's all right. I've already talked to the police and I've told Fall about it. The worst thing is that I'll have to talk to the boy's mother. He looked at me directly for the first time. You hadn't met Spiro? He asked. I only arrived last night, but Fall told me about him. Godfrey continued, I came here last year, and he's worked for me since then. He was a clever mechanic. He knew everything about boats. You know I'm writing a book and I need a lot of photographs for it. Well, Spiro helped me with those, too. In fact, I used him in some of them. He paused for a moment and then the tired gray eyes came back to me. I'd been taking some photographs at night, and I wanted to get some of the sun when it rose over the mountains with the snow still on them. Spiro and I took my boat out last night. There was some wind, but nothing to worry about. The sea wasn't really rough. I was below in the cabin, working on my camera, and suddenly the engine stopped. I went up on deck to see what had happened. Spiro was hanging over the side at the back of the boat. He was trying to find out what was wrong. I think I called to him to be careful, but just then the wind caught the boat and it swung over violently. Spiro was holding the rail, but it was wet and slippery and he lost his hold on it. He tried to catch it again, but missed and went over the side. By the time I reached the back of the boat, I couldn't even see him. He had disappeared. He couldn't swim? I asked. Oh, yes. But it was very dark and the boat was drifting fast. The wind was stronger by then, you see. I shouted again and again, but there was no reply. In the end, I managed to start the engine, and I searched for Spiro for 2 hours, but it was no good. I couldn't find him. You did all you could, said Philida sadly. Yes, but because I didn't find his body, perhaps his mother will hope that he'll come back. If he got as far as Albania, she could wait for years to discover what happened. Just as she did with his father, I added. He stared at me. His father. I forgot that. Poor woman. And it's worse because Spiro wasn't expecting to go out with me last night. I only asked him at the last minute. Philida looked thoughtful. Look, Godfrey, she said, when you go home, you'd better take these photographs with you. It wouldn't be very good for Maria to see them now. Oh, yes. Of course. He picked them up and, for a moment, he looked unsure of himself. Something made me say, are those the photographs for your book? Yes. Would you like to see them? He asked. There were several photographs of Spiro and the dolphin, and a wonderful one of them together. It was so good that I said, if I hadn't seen the dolphin myself, I wouldn't believe that this was real. Godfrey was interested. You say you've seen the dolphin? He asked. So I told them both about my morning adventure and about my meeting with Mr. Gale's son. Max Gale! Philida cried. Lucy, you're not trying to tell me that Max Gale was running about in the woods with a gun, are you? Don't be silly. Well, he did say it wasn't him, I said. Anyway, he hadn't got the gun any longer, so I couldn't prove it. But I didn't believe him, and he was very rude. Yes, but it couldn't have been him, Philida said. Probably not, agreed Godfrey. Philida looked at him sharply. What is it? She asked. Nothing. But Philida had understood. Her eyes opened wide and her face changed color. Oh, no. But I suppose it could be. But Godfrey, that's awful. If he got a gun. Look, I said strongly, if you two are talking about Sir Julian Gale, I've never heard anything so silly. He wouldn't shoot a dolphin. Everybody who worked with him loved him. It's not in his character. He couldn't do it, not unless he was drunk, or had gone mad. I stopped. There was a silence that could be felt. Then Philida turned to me. Look, you know that Julian Gale disappeared after he left the theater? You know about the car accident 3 or 4 years ago, when his wife and daughter were killed? Yes, of course. What happened? Was he ill? Yes, he was, I suppose. He had a nervous breakdown. He was in hospital for over a year. They say that he's better now, and he does go out sometimes to visit a few friends, but there's always someone with him. I said dully, you mean they have to watch him? You're trying to tell me that Julian Gale is. I paused. Why was it so difficult to put it into words? Oh, look, said Philida, when I met him, he seemed perfectly normal. There's probably nothing wrong. He just wants peace and quiet. And Max Gale wants to be left alone to work. He's writing the music for a film of The Tempest. That's probably why young Adoni guards the place. Young who? I said. Adoni, the gardener. She turned to Godfrey then and said something about Adoni. He had been a close friend of Spiro. Philida added something about Adoni, Miranda and Adari. Suddenly Godfrey Manning said, I must get back home in case anyone phones with some news. By the way, when is Leo coming over? I'm not sure, but certainly for Easter, with the children. Godfrey said goodbye and left. Philida and I sat in silence until the sound of his car was lost in the distance. Come on, then, where's lunch? I said. I'm hungry. As I followed Philida out of the room, I thought that the Gales probably knew about Spiro by now. I had seen Maria and Miranda when they left the house. They had taken the path that led only to the empty bay, or to the Castello de Fiori. Chapter 4. Days went by, peaceful, lovely days. Every day I went down to the bay to swim. Sometimes the dolphin came and I never left until he did. I wanted to be sure that nobody shot at him again. I also watched the terrace of the Castello, but there was no more shooting. There had been no news of Spiro, and Maria and Miranda came back to work the day after his death. They moved about the house sadly and silently. Miranda's eyes were often red from crying, and Maria stayed in the kitchen most of the time. On the Sunday before Easter, I went into Corfu town to watch the procession. This is one of the 4 times in the year when the body of the island's saint, Saint Spiridion, is brought out of the church and carried through the streets. The people believe that he takes care of the island and those who live there, and they love him very much. Therefore, the town was very crowded. Spiro's name was really Spiridion, too, and I wondered if Miranda was there. As the procession passed near me, there was a moment's silence, which was broken suddenly by the sound of a woman crying. I turned round. It was Miranda. When the procession moved on, the crowd began to leave, and I saw Miranda walk quickly away. I went back towards the place where I had left the car. Just then, I saw Miranda again. She was standing with her back to me, but her hands were up to her face, and I thought she was crying. I hesitated, but a man who had been standing near went and spoke to her. He seemed to be trying to persuade her to go with him, but she shook her head. I decided to go and speak to her. Miranda, it's Miss Lucy. I have the car here. Would you like to come home with me? The young man turned round. Oh, thank you. That's very kind. You must be Miss Waring? He was very handsome, and he looked about 19. Why, yes, I said in surprise. And then I realized who this was. And you're Adoni? Yes, he replied, and he smiled. He had very white teeth and beautiful eyes. In fact, he looked just like a young Greek god. When we reached the car, he took the keys from me and helped Miranda into the back. Then he came and sat beside me in the front. As we were driving, I asked him quietly, will Miranda and her mother have enough money now that Spiro's gone? They'll be cared for, he replied confidently. I'll marry Miranda. There's no dowry, but that doesn't matter. Spiro was my friend. Of course, Sir Gael may give her a dowry. I don't know. It won't make any difference. I'll take her with or without a dowry. Sir Gael will arrange the marriage. Sir Julian? Yes. He's the twins' godfather. Have you met him yet, Miss Waring? No. You've met Max, though, haven't you? Yes. I decided to talk about something else. Do you ever go out shooting, Adoni? I asked. He laughed. No, Miss Waring. I didn't shoot at your dolphin. No Greek would do so. Ah, here we are. Thank you very much. I'll take Miranda to her mother. Then I've promised to go to the Castello. Max wants to go out this afternoon. Perhaps I'll see you at the Castello soon? I don't think so, I replied. I watched Adoni take the silent Miranda through her mother's door, and I thought that it would be nice to have someone to take care of me like that. As I drove away, I realized that if Maxwell was going to be out, at least I could have my afternoon swim in peace. I went down to the bay after tea, when it was not so hot, and afterwards I began to climb slowly up the path to the villa. Suddenly I heard a bird cry out in terror. As I ran up the path, the two parent birds met me, screaming loudly. I rushed forward and I saw a beautiful white cat, which was about to attack a baby bird. I did the only thing possible, and dived onto the cat, took him gently by the body and held him. He tried hard to get free, but he didn't scratch or bite. I picked him up and began to carry him away from the birds. He seemed to like this and he started to purr. But he was very heavy, and finally I had to put him down. He looked up at me and then moved away and disappeared. I followed him out of the shadow of the trees and found myself in bright sunlight, in the middle of a lovely, wild garden. All around me were roses, sweet-smelling roses of every color, all in full flower. I stood still in delight. It was a beautiful, magical place. Then I remembered that Leo's grandfather had planted these roses when he lived in the Castello. Without thinking, I stretched out my hand and began to pick some of them. The white cat reappeared and sat on the top of a bank, watching me. Suddenly I heard a beautiful voice coming from just above me. I'd heard this voice many times before, in dark London theatres. It was Sir Julian Gale. The rose garden, I now realized in alarm, was at the foot of the terrace of the Castello and Sir Julian was standing there, looking down at me through some bushes. I tried to explain about the cat, but he saw the roses in my arms. "Ah," he said, smiling pleasantly, "you've been stealing my roses, I see. Oh, I never thought." "I'm terribly sorry," I said uncomfortably. "Well, now you must pay a forfeit." "You must come up and talk to me," ordered Sir Julian cheerfully. I hesitated, but it would have been rude to refuse. Slowly I went up the half-hidden steps and came out onto the terrace. "Come in, Miss Lucy Waring. You see, I know who you are. And here's my son. But, of course, you've already met." Maxwell was sitting in the shade, at a large table, which was covered with papers. He didn't seem very pleased when we disturbed him, but Sir Julian insisted that I must stay for a drink. I asked for an orange juice, and received an unexpected, warm smile from Maxwell. Sir Julian was not handsome, but he was a fine, big man with thick, grey hair. His eyes were tired, but he behaved quite naturally, except when he took his orange juice from Max. His hand shook quite badly. Sir Julian and I talked for a long time, about the world of the theater, the latest stories, and finally about myself. I talked, and he was a sympathetic listener. He seemed to enjoy our conversation, and I didn't notice the shadows of the castello moving towards us. Suddenly I realized that Maxwell was sitting behind us, listening. I felt that I had to say something to him before I left, and I asked him if he had seen the procession that morning. We went on to discuss the possibility that Corfu was Shakespeare's magic island in The Tempest. Sir Julian repeated what Philida had told me, that Max was writing the music for a film of The Tempest. When at last I rose to leave, Sir Julian begged me to visit him again. He came with me to the edge of the rose garden and pointed to the path through the woods. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of a piano. Maxwell was working again. The woods were dark and quiet, and as I went down the path I was thinking about Sir Julian. Suddenly I saw someone coming up the path from the bay. He was coming straight towards me, breathing heavily. He seemed to be trying not to make a noise. I stepped back behind the trees, and waited. He was Greek, someone I hadn't seen before, a young man. He stopped, took out a cigarette, but then decided not to light it. When he turned to go, I saw his face quite clearly. There was a look of excitement on it which made me afraid. Carefully, he continued on his way, up the path to the castello. The wind suddenly blew through the trees, and the air was cool. I stood quite still until I could no longer hear the sound of the Greek's footsteps.